Well, with just a few days to go for that big G20 summit in New Delhi, who better to talk to than to figure out exactly what's happening, what last-minute preparations are taking place, what the agenda is likely to be, and what the aims and objectives are. Then India's Sherpa to G20, Mr. Amitabh Kant. It's going to be a really hectic few days for you, so thank you so much for, first of all, taking the time to speak to us and tell us what lies ahead. There's going to be a Sherpa meeting first, right, from the 3rd, and then I guess that's when the final declarations will all be prepared before the summit. What's on the agenda for the next few days?
So, Vikram, for the last 15 days, we've been having virtual sessions with all the 20 plus 9 invitee countries and all the international organizations. We've discussed the draft. Now, it has to be discussed in person. We've had many challenging issues. Our draft is very ambitious. As the Prime Minister had wanted us to be ambitious, he wanted us to be very inclusive, which is what we have been. We've been very decisive and very forward-looking, and also very action-oriented. There are challenges. We are very hopeful of sorting them out, because when you're negotiating with 20 countries, G20 countries, the challenges of bringing in a consensus, and everybody has a veto power. Everybody has a veto power. And in multilateral discussions, the challenge is that you do not want, you try not to have a footnote. You try and bring everybody to the same level. That is what we've been attempting to do. We've been greatly successful, but hopefully we should see it through.
Well, presumably the biggest areas of remaining negotiation, where the biggest sticking points are going to be questions around Ukraine and geopolitics, and Russia and China seem to be dissociating a bit from what happened in Bali. So is that the biggest problem for you right now?
Well, that's a challenge. But let me first say that the Ukraine war is not our creation. For us, being the voice of the global South, to bring all the developmental issues up front, to be, as the Prime Minister said, very human-centric in our approach, and to focus on all our key priorities has been the primary aim. And all through the year, in our ministerials, we have pushed all these issues up front. We have brought them center stage. And we've pushed the India narrative, we've pushed the ambition, we've pushed all our key priorities. Those are important for us. Driving strong, sustainable, inclusive growth is the key task of G20. Driving sustainable development goals is the key task of G20. Driving, climate action and climate finance, and then ensuring that the multilateral financial institutions are able to provide adequate resources for both SDG and MDBs. The climate action should be, the resources must be able to come in from MDBs through new instruments of blended finance, credit guarantees, etc. And then digital transformation and the digital public infrastructure, which India has done enormously well at. And throughout the whole year, we evangelize that. And lastly, the Prime Minister's priority of women-led development, women's empowerment, gender equality, all that is key. So we've tried to bring all these issues center stage.
You spoke to us shortly after taking over as Sherpa, and you did say that development is going to be India's agenda and issues around the global South, and not so much geopolitics. But obviously, when it comes to the rest of the world watching this, then that geopolitics is one of the things that they will be looking at. There are going to be questions, for example, around the fact that Vladimir Putin is not going to be here, and that's perhaps understandable for other reasons. But neither will Xi Jinping, if the reports are to be believed.
So, well, we'll have the Chinese premier here. We'll have the Russian foreign minister here. And even in Bali, Mr. Lavrov represented Mr. Putin there. And but irrespective of that, let me tell you that there'll be a whole range of leaders here, and there will be all the heads of international organizations, and our discussions will be very lively, and we'll focus very strongly on these things. But the important thing from our perspective is that we should be able to get through all the developmental issues and then bring the Ukraine issue. In Bali, the Ukraine issue occupied center stage. We've been able to keep it at the back end and push all the ambitious issues through. And that has been demonstrated in the ministerials. The para 3 and 4 of the Bali, which really showed that the commitment towards UN Security Council resolutions, etc. And out of the para 3 and 4, we've been able to convince Russia to agree to para 4. So the only para of disagreement right now remains para 3. And we are very hopeful that when Sherpas meet, they are able to bring agreement on.
Well, India played a major role in helping to get that consensus at Bali. So presumably Brazil, which is about to take over, and other countries will also try and get some consensus draft which everyone can sign off on.
We are very hopeful that during our presidency, because the next presidency will be held by Brazil and subsequently by South Africa, all of them will collaborate with us to help bring consensus on the table. We are very hopeful. But I can assure you that consensus on the most ambitious issues of development and many other issues.
On all of those issues, it's already done.
We will move forward very vigorously.
The fact that Xi Jinping is not going to be here may actually, and paradoxically, help in one thing, that Bali also got overtaken a little bit by the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting and that bilateral, and that ended up taking all the headlines almost away from G20. So that, I guess, is not going to happen in
So
Delhi.
G20 is a very important summit. It discusses all the issues which is currently plaguing the world. And this is an occasion for leaders to discuss issues in the summit. It's important to focus on the summit rather than many bilaterals. And we should not allow bilaterals to overtake the summit. The summit is focused on Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. The summit is focused on one earth, one family, one future, and how to bring human-centric development. If that gets overshadowed, it'll be tragic.
So let's come to the summit. This app is, I mean, Delhi is all dressed up, is looking pretty, it's green. It's great that it's happening in September, so the air is also really clean. Must be really exciting, because I don't think Delhi or India, for that matter, have ever hosted something quite at this scale before.
Yeah, so everyone's worked together, and I'd really like to appreciate the work done by the Delhi Lieutenant Governor in marshalling all resources to really green Delhi and to bring in a lot of flowers and to really give it a nice, beautiful look with a lot of water fountains, etc. And Delhi looks nice. All of us should feel proud of our capital. And secondly, I think everyone from protocol to logistics to security, everyone has done a tremendous job, and hopefully we should be able to do a really top-class professional event here. Our objective is to be very systematic, to be very professional, to be very methodical in all this, and not allow to remain focused on the summit.
So, people watching this all around the world, they'll say, what should we be really looking for in Delhi? What should we be anticipating to see? Of course, there's a new convention center that they're going to get to see. Maybe if you could just share a little glimpse of what's going to happen in those 2 or 3 days when all the world leaders are here.
So when the world leaders are here, they will actually be spending most of their time at the summit. That's 1.5 days. They will also go to the Raj Ghat, pay homage to our father of nation, and also send the message of peace there. And the spouses have a separate treatment. They go to the Agricultural Research Institute and they spend a day at the National Gallery of Modern Art, going through culture, going through many other experiences. So as far as the leaders are concerned, their focus remains the summit. We want to remain very, very focused on the summit.
And what would you like the headlines to be coming out of the summit? I mean, I know you can't craft the headlines and they're almost things. What would you like the summit and India's presidency to be remembered by?
Well, I think first of all, the presidency should really, the headline should be about growth and development of the world, because that's what India is focused on. It's about the last mile. It's about citizens. Our presidency has been very citizen-centric, and therefore, the impact that it will have on the community of the world in terms of SDGs, in terms of we should not lose track of the basic growth issues, because 1/3 of the world is in recession. 75 countries are in global debt. They're going through a very terrible period. You have 200 million people who've gone below poverty line. 100 million people have lost their jobs. So our presidency should be remembered for its unique contribution to both the citizens of the world, to growth of the world, which is sustainable and inclusive, and for being the voice of the global south. Because that's important, because 80% of the growth this year is going to come from global south. 2/3 of the growth in the coming 2 decades will come from emerging markets. And therefore, you need resources to flow into these markets. These countries have a young population, low dependency burden, unlike the aging population in many G7 countries.
So when you look at, I'm going to just go into some of the aspects that you were talking about in slightly greater detail. Let's start with growth. And obviously the headlines coming out of India right now when it comes to growth, okay, you could quibble about some of the statistics and statistical effects of the pandemic, but the fact that we've just announced 7.8% for Q1, it's a big number to be actually going into G20 with, saying, look, this is the growth that's happening here. What are you going to be telling the rest of the world when it comes to growth? Any of the lessons that they can...
So I think the most important thing is the political and the developmental narrative, that you have a leader who's won the election twice in a democracy and whose public rating is still 80%. So that's a very high, your political leader has a lot of credibility, huge credibility, being a democracy and winning elections in democracy. Second is the development narrative, that you've built 40 million houses, you've done about 80,000 kilometers of road, you've done 110 million toilets, you've done 23 million of water pipelines. All these are remarkable success stories. And the fact that we were able to do 2.2 billion COVID vaccination, and that we do 46% of the real-time digital payments in the world. I mean, we are doing 11x more payment than USA and Europe. We do 4x more than China. All these is remarkable development stories. So India hosts the G20 with a huge developmental and a great political narrative at that.
There's also a good story for India to tell when it comes to climate change, right? Because that is one area where, if you look at the Paris goals and what was outlined, if you look at the share of India's energy that is now being contributed by renewables, it's really high. It's one of the highest now in the world and growing very fast. Do you think India will also be using, and you will be using, G20 to talk about some of that and to talk about some things like One World, solar grid and the solar
of course.
that we're talking about?
No, it's a huge story. India is the only country which achieved its NDC targets 9 years ahead of schedule. India is the only country, only G20 country to figure in the list of the top 10 countries in the Clean Climate Index. So we've done whatever we could do. We've gone way ahead of other countries. We need not be apologists at all. We have done much better than any G20 country, or for that matter, any country.
Where the story becomes a little bit more problematic, perhaps, or there are questions around it, is what you were saying about the global south. Now, India's always wanted to, and right from independence, we've been champions of the idea of the global south and getting the global south together. But as we've seen recently, you see it in BRICS, you see it in other things, there are tensions between the global south. I mean, there are tensions between India and China, which we all know about, and other such countries. So is it a bit of a mythical creature trying to put the global south together, given the contradictions that lie even within the global south?
So, when we started our presidency, the Prime Minister held a meeting of the global south. 125 leaders participated. We got the inputs. Based on that, we based our priorities. And India is the first country which has really, Prime Minister wrote to all the leaders that we should make African Union a permanent member of G20, and that will be a major achievement. The issue has had a very wide support from all the leaders, and that will be a huge, huge achievement.
I was about to actually come to that, because that may well end up being one of the biggest headlines in the Indian presidency, if there is actual movement on that, giving the African continent a seat at G20 in a substantive manner. I mean, of course, there are countries...
No, that will be a major achievement, but there will be many, many more. India will have many more achievements than what any other presidency has achieved. I can assure you that. our achievements will be very far-reaching.
All right, we're waiting to hear some of that. Now, on the other issues which are of India's interest, that is the reform of the United Nations Security Council and other things, and there's been talk about that. There are even hints at the BRICS summit. But again, with countries like China presumably having a veto power on that, is there likely to be movement on that or no?
Well, some of these issues have been discussed. Some of these issues will be discussed at the leaders' level, so it will be premature for me to comment on some of these issues at this stage.
All right. Looking now again at, I'm again trying to arrive at the sort of consensus views that you are particularly driving for. When you're sitting with the Sherpa next week, 3rd to the 7th, do you have your ideas of 1, 2, 3, 4 top things that I'm hoping
so one
to get
is
them
to get a consensus on multilateral reforms. That
Which is not just the Security Council,
it's the
but
financing,
other things?
financing.
Global financing.
Yeah, global finance. To get a consensus on climate action, to get a huge consensus on the new SDG action plan coming out of G20, to get a consensus on women-led development, that is women empowerment and gender equality, to get a consensus around our own model of digital public infrastructure. That will be huge. So there's a vacuum on digital public infrastructure today. There's no financial architecture around it. To be able to do that.
And will you be suggesting that, for example, the Indian models on UPI could be taken to other countries?
Of course. That will be a very major step forward to accept the definition of DPI, because the world is only used to big tech, both here and in China, in the western part of the world and China. To accept the definition of digital public infrastructure, to accept the framework of digital public infrastructure, and then to drive it all over the world.
All the items that you said, other than reforming the multilateral organizations, hopefully we should be able to get some sort of a consensus, as you're saying.
We are quite hopeful. We are quite positive. We are quite optimistic.
So the problems will eventually only come down to geopolitics, like Ukraine and Russia and China and what they're going to say.
We will discuss after we finish discussing the developmental issues. The important thing is to get developmental issues ahead. If you are not able to get the developmental issues ahead, then you will be caught up in 5 days of just geopolitics, which war is not our creation. War is not India's creation. It's not a creation of the global south. The G20 should really think of the global south to make it human-centric and to ensure that no one is left behind, and then finally come to the critical issue of.
Well, once this is done, India's already handed over B20 in a sense to Brazil, and then after the summit is over, there are another couple of months to go, and then India hands over G20 to Brazil as well. How do you think the year has gone? If you were to make a absolutely honest and candid assessment, I know it's difficult to do that, but how do you think the year's gone?
I think it's been tough, it's been challenging, it's been complex, but India has done extremely well. India's held the G20 presidency like nobody has ever done before. Taking G20 from, instead of one city, to 60 cities of India, taking it to all the states of India, taking it to the citizens of India, taking it to every single common man of India, and making sure that yet you remain very inclusive, very, very inclusive, very decisive, very action-oriented, and be the voice of the global south has been a very satisfying experience.
Well, Amitabh Kant, you've got a really, really busy week and a busy 10 days ahead of you. It's been a great job as Sherpa ever since you take over. You've got this final lap to run, so all the best with it.
Thank you.
And our compliments. We'll perhaps talk to you after G20 is over to see, hopefully you'll get the consensus on all the issues that you're hoping for.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.